Gunfire cracked through the mountain silence like thunder splitting stone. Ezekiel Thornfield dropped his axe and spun toward the sound, his weathered hands instinctively reaching for the rifle propped against his cabin wall. 3 years of solitude in these Colorado peaks had taught him to distinguish between a hunter's careful shot and the desperate spray of men with murder on their minds. The shots came again closer now, echoing off the canyon walls in a rhythm that spoke of pursuit and panic. Through the swirling snow that had been falling since dawn, he caught sight of movement on the ridge above his homestead. A figure stumbled through the drifts, dark against the white, moving with the jerky desperation of someone running on borrowed time. Ezekiel's blue eyes, faded but sharp as winter wind, tracked the runner's descent. When the figure collapsed 50 yards from his door, he saw the flash of copper skin and long black hair spilling across the snow like spilled ink. A woman, Apache, by the look of her buckskin dress and beadwork. Though what she was doing this far north in white man's territory was beyond his reckoning. More shots rang out from the ridge, and Ezekiel caught sight of 4 riders silhouetted against the gray sky. Even at this distance, he could read their intent in the way they sat their horses, hard men with harder business in mind. The woman tried to rise, fell back, tried again. Blood stained the snow beneath her like scattered rubies. Without thinking, Ezekiel broke cover and ran. His boots crunched through the crusted snow as bullets whined overhead, the riders having spotted him now. He reached the woman just as she collapsed again, her dark eyes fierce as a cornered wildcat's meeting his with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "You must go," she whispered in accented English, her voice barely audible above the wind. "They will kill you too." Ezekiel didn't waste breath on words. He scooped her up, surprised at how light she felt despite her height, and bolted for his cabin. Behind them, the riders were descending the slope at a reckless pace, their horses sliding and scrambling on the treacherous terrain. He kicked open his cabin door and deposited the woman on his bed before grabbing his Winchester from the wall. Through the single window, he could see the 4 men spreading out, trying to flank his position. Professional killers, then, not the usual drunken cowboys or claim jumpers who sometimes wandered into his valley. Her words were cut off by the thunder of hoofbeats circling the cabin. Ezekiel levered around into his rifle's chamber, the metallic click sharp in the cabin's warmth. Outside, one of the riders called out in Spanish, then switched to English. "Old man, send out the Apache whore, and we'll let you live to see another sunrise." Ezekiel positioned himself at the window, his rifle barrel resting on the sill. 3 years ago, when consumption took his wife Martha, he'd thought his fighting days were over. But as he looked at the wounded woman on his bed, her proud face set with the kind of courage that made empires tremble, he felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with the man he used to be. "Mister," he called back, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down worse odds, "you best turn those horses around and ride back where you came from. This is my land, and she's under my protection now." The only answer was the crack of rifle fire. The first bullet shattered Ezekiel's window, spraying glass across the cabin floor. He rolled away from the frame, pulling the wounded Apache woman down with him, as splinters exploded from the log wall where her head had been moments before. "What is your name?" he asked, reloading his Winchester with practiced efficiency. "Ayana," she replied, pressing a torn piece of her dress against the bullet wound in her side. "It means eternal blossom, in my tongue." "Well, Miss Ayana, I'm Ezekiel Thornfield, and those men picked the wrong mountain to die on today." He belly-crawled to the shattered window and fired twice in quick succession. One of the riders yelped and tumbled from his horse. The gunfight that followed was brutal and methodical. Navarro's men had expected an easy kill on Old Hermit and a wounded Indian woman. Instead, They found themselves pinned down by a marksman, who knew every rock and tree in his domain. Ezekiel had built his cabin in a natural fortress, with the mountain wall at his back and clear fields of fire in 3 directions. Between volleys, Ayanna told him her story in broken whispers. She was daughter to a peace chief who'd tried to negotiate safe passage through territorial lands. Miguel Navarro, a Mexican gunrunner with ambitions of empire, had promised protection in exchange for information about Apache gold. When her father refused, Navarro had ordered the massacre of their entire band. 23 people, she said, her voice hollow. Children, elders, all dead because one white devil wanted treasure that does not exist. Ezekiel paused in his reloading. No treasure. Ayanna's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Apache stories of gold are like white man's stories of honest politicians' beautiful lies told to children. As the day wore on, the siege settled into a deadly rhythm. The killers would rush the cabin in pairs while the others provided covering fire, then retreat to lick their wounds and plan the next assault. Ezekiel's ammunition was running low, and Ayanna was growing weaker despite her efforts to help by reloading his spent cartridges. During a lull in the fighting, she caught his arm. "Why do you help me, your people and mine? We have spilled much blood between us." Ezekiel looked at her really. Despite her pain, there was a strength in her face that reminded him of Martha. The same fierce independence that had drawn him to his wife all those years ago. But there was something else, something that made his pulse quicken in a way he'd thought dead and buried. "My Martha always said a man's measure isn't taken by the color of folks he helps, but by whether he helps when help is needed." He chambered another round. "Besides, any woman who can outrun Navarro's killers for 50 miles through a blizzard deserves better than dying in my cabin." 53 miles, she corrected, with the ghost of a smile. "And I do not plan to die today." As if summoned by her words, the remaining 3 attackers launched their final assault. They came from all sides at once, screaming like demons, their guns blazing. Ezekiel managed to drop one more before his Winchester ran dry. He drew his Colt revolver, but knew it was too little too late. That's when Ayanna rose from the bed like an avenging spirit. In her hands was Ezekiel's spare rifle, a Old Sharp's buffalo gun he'd thought unloaded. The massive .50 caliber rifle boomed like cannon fire, and one of the remaining killers simply ceased to exist above the waist. The last man, seeing his companions dead or dying, broke and ran for his horse. Ayanna worked the Sharp's action with hands that shook from blood loss, but never wavered in purpose. The rifle spoke once more, and the final killer tumbled into the snow, never to rise again. In the sudden silence that followed, Ayanna collapsed. Ezekiel caught her before she hit the floor, feeling her warm blood seeping through his shirt. Her eyes were losing focus, but she managed to whisper, "Is it ... finished?" "It's finished," he promised, though he wondered if she would live to see another dawn. For 3 days, Ayanna danced on the knife's edge between life and death. Ezekiel tended her with the desperate skill of a man who'd lost too much already. He cleaned her wound with whiskey, stitched it closed with thread from Martha's old sewing kit, and forced broth between her lips when fever made her delirious. On the second night, she spoke in rapid Apache, her voice urgent with words he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. She was reliving the massacre, he realized, fighting battles that existed only in fevered memory. He held her hand through the worst of it, his calloused fingers gentle against her burning skin. By dawn of the 4th day, the fever broke. Ayanna's eyes opened clear and lucid, focusing on Ezekiel's face with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of his unkempt beard and worried expression. "You look terrible," she said. And he laughed despite himself, a sound that hadn't echoed in his cabin for 3 long years. "Well, you look like you've been shot and left for dead in a snowstorm," he replied. "So I reckon we're even." She tried to sit up and winced. "The men Navarro's killers. Feeding the wolves, last I checked." though we'll need to move their bodies come spring thaw, else they'll poison my creek." Ayana nodded slowly, and Navarro himself, Ezekiel's expression darkened. "Still out there, I'd guess. Men like him don't do their own killing if they can help it." Over the following weeks, as Ayana healed and the worst of winter settled over the mountains, they developed an odd but comfortable routine. She taught him words in Apache while he showed her how to operate the cabin's wood stove and oil lamps. She mended his clothes with delicate stitches that put his own rough repairs to shame, while he carved her a new pair of snowshoes to replace the ones lost during her flight. They spoke of everything and nothing her childhood in the desert, his years as a cavalry scout before homesteading, the books he'd read aloud to Martha during her final illness, the songs Ayana's grandmother had taught her about the creation of the world. Slowly, carefully, they circled around the growing awareness that what lay between them was more than simple gratitude or loneliness. One evening, as February wind howled around the cabin's walls, Ayana found Ezekiel staring at a daguerreotype of his late wife. Martha had been beautiful in the pale, delicate way of Eastern women, nothing like Ayana's fierce, angular features and copper skin. "She was lovely," Ayana said softly. She was. Ezekiel set the photograph aside, died thinking she was a failure as a wife because we never had children. Truth was, I was the lucky one just to have her for the years we did. Ayana moved closer, her moccasined feet silent on the plank floor. Do you think the dead would want the living to stop living for their sake?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Ezekiel looked at her, truly looked, and saw not just the Apache woman he'd saved, but a soul as scarred and seeking as his own. When had her presence stopped being a duty and become a joy? When had her laughter become more necessary to him than his morning coffee? "I think Martha would box my ears if she knew I'd been acting like a corpse these past 3 years," he said finally. Ayana smiled, and in that smile was an invitation as old as the mountains themselves. She placed her hand over his, her skin warm despite the winter cold. "Then perhaps it is time to stop acting like one." Outside, the wind sang its lonely song. But inside the cabin, 2 wounded hearts began the careful work of healing each other. When the spring melt began in earnest, it brought more than just rushing water and wildflowers. It brought Miguel Navarro himself, along with 20 hard-faced men who made his previous killers look like choir boys. Ezekiel spotted them first, their dust cloud visible from miles away as they wound up the mountain trail. He'd been splitting firewood behind the cabin, while Ayana hung laundry on the line they'd strung between 2 pines. In the months since her recovery, she'd taken to wearing one of Martha's old dresses, a blue calico that complemented her dark beauty in ways that made Ezekiel's heart race like a schoolboy's. "Company coming," he called, setting down his axe. "The kind that shoots first and asks questions, never." Ayana dropped the wet shirt she'd been hanging and moved with fluid grace to retrieve the rifle. She kept propped against the cabin wall. The easy domesticity of their winter together vanished like smoke, replaced by the sharp awareness of predators closing in. "How many?" she asked, levering around into the chamber. 20, maybe 25. Too many for a straight fight. Ezekiel's mind raced through possibilities. The cabin that had served as fortress against 4 men would be a death trap against these odds. They had perhaps an hour before the riders reached the homestead. Working with the efficiency of long partnership, they gathered supplies, ammunition, dried food, medical supplies, and loaded them into canvas packs. Ezekiel led Ayana to a cave system he'd discovered high on the mountain face, accessible only by a treacherous trail that would favor defenders over attackers. "This is where we make our stand," he said, gesturing to the natural fortress of stone. "They'll have to come at us single file, and there's water deeper in the cave system." Ayana studied the approaches with a tactician's eye. "Your Martha, did she ever fight beside you?" The question surprised him. "No. She was gentle, peaceful. Said violence was man's failing, not his virtue. She was wise. But wisdom takes different forms for different times. Ayanna checked her rifle's action one more time. I have killed 11 men in my life. Ezekiel Thornfield. Today I may kill 11 more if they threaten what I hold dear. The admission should have shocked him. Instead, he found himself admiring her fierce honesty. Martha's gentleness had been a blessing during peaceful times, but Ayanna's strength might be what kept them both alive in the days ahead. They didn't have long to wait. Navarro's men reached the cabin by late afternoon, their leader's voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air as he shouted orders in rapid Spanish. Through his field glasses, Ezekiel got his first clear look at the Mexican gunrunner. Navarro was a man of average height, but commanding presence. His silver-threaded beard and expensive clothes marking him as someone accustomed to power. When his men reported the cabin empty, he dismounted and examined the ground around the building with the careful attention of an experienced tractor. "He's good," Ezekiel muttered, watching Navarro follow their trail toward the mountain face. "Too good." "Then we must be better," Ayanna replied simply. The assault began at dawn. Navarro had positioned sharpshooters on the ridges opposite their cave while sending men up the narrow trail in groups of 3. The confined space worked in the defenders' favor, initially Ezekiel and Ayanna could pick off attackers at their leisure while remaining concealed behind natural stone ramparts. But Navarro was cunning. As the morning wore on, he began sending men up alternate routes, trying to flank their position. Worse, he had dynamite miners' explosives that could collapse their shelter and bury them alive. During a brief lull in the fighting, as Navarro's men regrouped for another assault, Ayanna turned to Ezekiel with an expression he'd learned to recognize. It was the same look she'd worn when rising from his bed to fire the Sharp's rifle. The face of someone prepared to sacrifice everything for those they loved. "There is another way out of this cave," she said quietly. "A passage that leads to the north face. I could circle around, take them from behind while they're focused on you." "No." His response was immediate and absolute. "I won't lose you. Not now. Not when we've finally found each other." She cupped his weathered face in her hands. "And I will not watch you die for my sake. This is my war, Ezekiel. Let me finish it." Before he could protest further, the sound of approaching boots echoed from the trail below. The final assault was beginning. "There's something I need to tell you," Ayanna said as rifle fire began to echo from the cave entrance. Her dark eyes held secrets that made Ezekiel's blood run cold. Even before she spoke the words, "Miguel Navarro is not just a gunrunner. He is my husband." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ezekiel's feet. Outside their stone sanctuary, men were dying in his name, but all he could hear was the thundering of his own heart. "You're what?" "A marriage arranged by my father when I was 16. A political alliance meant to protect our people from Mexican raiders." Ayanna's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she reloaded her rifle. "I ran away after the wedding ceremony before the marriage could be ... completed. I have been fleeing him for 7 years. Ezekiel stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew. "The massacre your people were killed because Navarro finally tracked me down. My father refused to force my return, so Navarro made an example of them all." Tears cut tracks through the dust on her face. 23 people died because I chose love over duty." "What love?" The words came out harsher than Ezekiel intended. You fool." Her smile was heartbreaking in its tenderness. "I loved the idea of you before I ever met you. The stories the old ones told of white soldiers who fought with honor, who kept their word even when it cost them dear. When I saw you risk your life for a stranger, I knew the stories were true." Gunfire erupted closer now, accompanied by the acrid smell of black powder. Navarro's men had reached the cave's outer chamber. They had minutes, maybe less, before the final confrontation. "If you're his wife..." "I am his wife-in-law only. In my heart, I have been yours since the moment you carried me from that snowbank." She pressed something into his hands, a small leather pouch he'd seen her working on during the long winter evenings. Inside were 2 rings, carved from mountain stone with intricate Apache symbols. "Marry me, Ezekiel Thornfield. Here, now, before whatever comes next." It was madness. They were surrounded by killers, outnumbered 10 to 1, facing almost certain death. But as Ezekiel looked into Ayana's fierce, beautiful face, he realized that madness was exactly what the moment required. "I, Ezekiel Thornfield, take you, Ayana, as my wife," he said, sliding one of the stone rings onto her finger. "In sickness and health, in war and peace, for whatever time we have left." "And I take you as my husband," she replied, placing the second ring on his hand. "May the spirits of mountain and sky witness our union." They kissed then, hard and desperate, as if they could pour a lifetime of love into a single moment. When they broke apart, both were crying. "Now," Ayana said, chambering a round in her rifle, "let us show my former husband what a real marriage looks like." The attack came in waves. Navarro had learned from his men's earlier failures and coordinated a simultaneous assault from multiple directions. Explosions shook the cave walls as dynamite charges detonated, filling the air with choking dust and falling rock. Ezekiel and Ayana fought back to back, their movements synchronized by months of shared danger and newfound love. When Ezekiel's ammunition ran low, Ayana passed him loaded cartridges without being asked. When she was momentarily pinned down by covering fire, he drew the attacker's attention with deliberately exposed shots, but they were losing ground. For every man they killed, 2 more seemed to take his place. Worse, Navarro himself had entered the cave now, his voice cutting through the gunfire like a blade. "Ayana, enough of this foolishness. You are my wife by law and God's will. Surrender yourself and I will let your lover live." "She's not your wife anymore," Ezekiel shouted back, firing at a muzzle flash in the darkness. "She's mine, and you'll have to kill us both to take her." Navarro's laughter echoed off the stone walls. "That can be arranged, old man. That can very easily be arranged." The final charge came with the fury of a spring avalanche. A dozen men poured into their defensive position, overwhelming them through sheer numbers. Ezekiel felt a bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around, and watched in horror as another man's shot sent Ayana tumbling behind a boulder. As darkness closed over his vision, the last thing he heard was Navarro's triumphant voice. "Take them alive. I want them to watch each other die slowly." Part 6. The Reckoning. Ezekiel awoke to the sound of his own blood dripping onto stone. He hung suspended between 2 wooden posts that Navarro's men had driven into the cave floor. His arms stretched above his head and his feet barely touching ground. Every muscle in his body screamed protest, but the real agony came from what he saw across the chamber. Ayana hung in identical fashion, her head lolling forward, dark hair hiding her face. Blood stained the blue calico dress, Martha's dress that she'd worn through their brief, impossible courtship. For a heart-stopping moment, Ezekiel thought she was dead. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest and felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. Ah, the happy bridegroom awakens. Miguel Navarro emerged from the shadows, his expensive clothes now torn and dusty, his silver beard matted with sweat. "I must say, your wedding was rather unconventional. But then, Apache savages have always been primitive in their customs." "Let her go," Ezekiel croaked, his throat raw from shouting during the battle. "Your quarrel is with her, not me." "On the contrary, old man, you have stolen something that belongs to me." Navarro drew a long, curved knife from his belt, a beautiful weapon with silver inlay that caught the torchlight like trapped stars. "Under Mexican law, she is my property. Under Apache law, she is my wife. Under any law that matters, she is mine to do with as I please." Not anymore. The voice came from Ayanna, who had lifted her head to stare at her captor with undimmed defiance. I chose my path, Miguel. I chose my husband. Kill us if you must, but I will never be yours. Navarro backhanded her with casual brutality, splitting her lip and snapping her head to the side. Ezekiel strained against his bonds with such fury that the wooden posts creaked ominously. You filthy dog, I'll tear your heart out. Will you indeed? Navarro smiled, pressing the knife's point against Ayanna's throat hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. How refreshing to see such passion. Tell me, does the old goat please you in bed? Does he make you scream with pleasure the way I will make you scream with pain? He makes me feel like a woman instead of a possession, Ayanna replied calmly. Something you could never understand. The knife pressed deeper, and Ezekiel felt his sanity beginning to fray. In desperation, he looked around the cave, searching for anything that might give them an advantage. That's when he noticed something that made his heart leap. The leather thong around Ayanna's neck, nearly hidden by her hair, held a small metal object that glinted in the torchlight. The key to their shackles. She must have palmed it somehow during their capture, hidden it in the only place Navarro's men wouldn't think to search thoroughly. But she was too far away, hanging 8 feet from where he was bound, and her arms were stretched above her head just as his were. Unless you want to know about passion, Navarro, Ezekiel called out, putting every ounce of scorn he could muster into his voice. I'll tell you about passion. Every night for months, your wife came to my bed willingly. Eagerly, she couldn't get enough of a real man's touch. It was a lie, of course. They had shared nothing more than stolen kisses and whispered endearments during their winter together. But Ezekiel had fought alongside enough hot-blooded men to know that jealousy could make even careful killers stupid. Navarro's face went crimson with rage. You dare speak such filth about my wife? Your wife? Ezekiel laughed, the sound echoing harsh and mocking in the enclosed space. Boy, she hasn't been your wife since the day she ran away. She's been mine since the moment I pulled her from that snowbank. Mine in every way that matters. With a wordless snarl of fury, Navarro abandoned his post beside Ayanna and stalked toward Ezekiel, the curved knife raised to strike. It was exactly what Ezekiel had hoped, and exactly what Ayanna had been waiting for. The moment Navarro's back was turned, she began to swing, using her bound wrists as a fulcrum to build momentum. Back and forth she went, each arc carrying her higher, until she could hook her feet around the crossbeam that supported her restraints. With strength born of desperation, she pulled herself up just high enough to work the leather thong over her head with her teeth. The key dropped into her bound hands just as Navarro reached Ezekiel. The Mexican's first cut laid open Ezekiel's chest from collarbone to sternum, drawing a spray of blood and a grunt of pain. The second would have opened his throat if Ezekiel hadn't twisted desperately away. How does it feel to die for an Apache whore? Navarro hissed, raising the knife for a killing stroke. The blade never fell. Ayanna's feet, now free from their bonds, caught Navarro in the back of the skull with a kick that sent him sprawling across the cave floor. She dropped lightly to the ground, her hands still manacled, but no longer helpless, and snatched up the fallen knife. Navarro rolled to his feet with the quick grace of a man accustomed to violence, drawing a pistol from his belt. But Ayanna was already moving, the curved blade spinning through the air with deadly accuracy. It took him in the throat, severing the great vessels there, and Miguel Navarro died, choking on his own blood. In the sudden silence that followed, Ayanna fumbled with the key until she managed to free Ezekiel from his bonds. He collapsed into her arms, both of them bloody and battered, but alive. Is it finished now? She asked, the same words she'd spoken after the first battle at his cabin. It's finished, he promised, and this time he knew it was true. 6 months later, Ezekiel stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching Ayanna tend the vegetable garden they'd planted together. The summer sun had bronzed her skin to an even deeper copper, and her hair, now grown past her shoulders, caught the light like captured starfire. She'd traded Martha's blue calico for buckskin clothing of her own making, decorated with beadwork that told the story of their love in symbols older than written words. The events in the cave had changed them both. Ezekiel carried new scars on his chest and arms, while Ayanna bore a thin white line across her throat where Navarro's blade had pressed too close to ending everything. But there were other changes too, deeper ones that showed in the way they moved together with the fluid synchronization of two people who had faced death and chosen life. "The corn is coming in well," Ayanna called, straightening from her work with a satisfied smile. "Better than I expected at this altitude. Apache farming wisdom beats Colorado stubbornness every time," Ezekiel replied, earning himself a handful of dirt thrown in his direction. They had married again in the spring, this time with proper legal documentation provided by the circuit judge, who rode through the territory every few months. The ceremony had been simple, just the two of them, the judge and his wife standing in the wildflower meadow above their cabin. But Ayanna had insisted on wearing the stone rings they'd exchanged in the cave, symbols of vows made in desperate love and sealed in blood. The legal complications of Navarro's death had been surprisingly minimal. It seemed the Mexican gunrunner had been wanted by authorities on both sides of the border for crimes ranging from murder to slave trading. When his body was found in the cave, along with those of his men, the territorial marshal had ruled a justifiable homicide and closed the case without further investigation. Now, as autumn painted the aspen trees in shades of gold and crimson, Ezekiel found himself marveling at how completely his life had transformed. The lonely widower who had chopped wood in bitter solitude was gone, replaced by a man who woke each morning eager to see what adventures the day might bring. "Riders coming," Ayanna announced, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. 3 of them from the South Trail. Ezekiel felt his muscles tense automatically, then forced himself to relax. Not all visitors brought violence. They'd had several peaceful encounters with travelers and traders over the summer months. Still, he made sure his rifle was within easy reach as the horsemen approached. The lead rider was an elderly Apache man with silver-streaked braids and wearing the traditional clothing of a peace chief. Behind him rode 2 younger warriors, their faces painted for ceremony rather than war. As they drew closer, Ayanna gasped and dropped her gardening tools. "Grandfather Nalnish," she whispered, then broke into a run toward the approaching riders. The old chief dismounted with the careful dignity of advanced age and embraced his granddaughter, speaking rapidly in Apache while tears streamed down both their faces. Ezekiel approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome, but Nalnish turned to him with eyes that held both wisdom and approval. "So, you are the man who saved my granddaughter's life and won her heart," the chief said in accented but clear English. "I am Nalnish, war leader of the Chiricahua, and I have come to thank you for what you did. Ayanna saved my life as much as I saved hers." Ezekiel replied honestly, "Maybe more." Nalnish smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "A good answer. It shows you understand the nature of true partnership." He glanced around the homestead, taking in the thriving garden, the well-built cabin, and the obvious signs of prosperity and contentment. "You have built a good life here together." Over the evening meal, Nalnish explained that news of Navarro's death had spread throughout Apache territory, bringing relief to tribes who had lived in fear of the gunrunners' raids. He had come not only to thank Ezekiel personally, but to offer both of them a place among his people if they ever chose to leave their mountain home. "Your courage has earned you honor among the Chiricahua," he told Ezekiel. "You would be welcome in our camps as a brother and warrior." "I'm honored by the offer," Ezekiel replied, "but this mountain is our home now. This is where our love began, and this is where we'll build our future together." Nalnish nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then let us speak of other matters. Ayanna tells me you wish to have children. Among our people, there are ceremonies to bless such desires, rituals that call upon the spirits of fertility and protection." The conversation that followed filled in gaps that Ezekiel hadn't even realized existed in his understanding of Ayana's culture and beliefs. He learned about Apache traditions surrounding marriage and family, about the spiritual significance of the stone rings they wore, and about the prophecies that spoke of harmony between different peoples in times to come. As the evening wound down and Nolnish prepared to make camp in their meadow, he pulled Ayana aside for a private conversation. Ezekiel couldn't understand the words, but he saw his wife nod solemnly several times before embracing her grandfather with obvious emotion. Later, as they lay together in their bed, with moonlight streaming through the window, Ayana explained what her grandfather had told her. He says the spirits have been speaking to him in dreams. They show him a vision of children, our children, who will be bridges between the Apache and white worlds. Teachers and peacemakers who will help both peoples understand each other. Ezekiel pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. "And what do you think of these visions?" "I think," she said, rising up to look into his eyes, "that we should do everything in our power to make them come true." Outside their window, the mountain wind sang its eternal song through the pines. But inside the cabin, a different kind of music played the quiet harmony of two souls who had found their perfect match against all odds and all reason. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to prove that love could indeed conquer all. But tonight was theirs alone, and it was enough. In the distance, a wolf howled its wild song to the stars, and somewhere in the darkness, its mate answered with a call that spoke of loyalty, devotion, and the fierce joy of hearts united forever.